This is a book that Jason Wittenberg and I, he's from Berkeley, we worked on for too long. It should be out any day, so it's waiting for it in the mail. And it's going to pull together some articles that we did. I'll speak for 20 minutes, hopefully. June, July 1941, the whole book happens in a 2-month period. Basically from June 22nd, 1941, the beginning of World War II on the Eastern Front, until the end of July. That's interesting. Why is that over there like that? That's kind of, is there a projector that needs to be moved, or, yeah. Because, yeah. Go ahead. This is The Economist. That's what you guys paid the big bucks for. Operation Barbarossa. This crowd, I don't need to tell who that is. This is the largest battle in human history. 3 million soldiers along a 1,500-mile front. 200,000 horses, right, involved in this alone. Not to mention all the tanks and artillery and soldiers. The Germans roll through very quickly. They're trying not to create any problems on their home front. Fast war. Blitzkrieg is the German word for it. As they pass through, in approximately 300 out of 3,000 settlements, the locals turn violently against the Jewish population. So it's in what had been eastern Poland, the Baltic states, western Ukraine, which was part of Poland in the interwar period, places that had been occupied by the Soviets since 1939 under the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Right? So that just gives you a little bit of historical context. We're calling these pogroms. We mean neighbor-on-neighbor violence. We don't mean the Germans come into a village and kill everybody. That's not a pogrom. Sometimes people will call that a pogrom, but that's not the phenomenon we're in. We're interested in neighbors attacking neighbors. Right? Not fully spontaneous, but also not really planned either. And conceptually, we can talk about that later. It's not that easy. There are pictures of this. There are YouTubes of this. So, trigger warning. That's Lvov, June 30th, 1941. It's actually June 30th, not July. That shows you there's sexual violence involved in it. That's a Ukrainian militiaman right there. Notice he's wearing actually a Soviet cap, though. He was, but he's now chasing a Jewish woman. Iași pogrom, Romania, June 28th, 1941. Probably the most famous incident, the garage massacre in Kaunas, Lithuania, Kovno in Polish. June 27th, there's a Lithuanian guy with a pipe wrench, beats to death 45 or 50 Jews. You see them there. Afterwards, he takes an accordion and plays the national anthem. We know this picture was taken by a German army photographer. Those are Germans in the background there. That's a Lithuanian militiaman. There's a Lithuanian activist front, which is a fascist group that was armed by the German army and invaded with them. Observations. One of the interesting things about the Holocaust is that it's usually been studied as a case of impersonal, distant violence from 30,000 feet, as it were. This is really, our view of the Holocaust has totally changed in the last decade. It's now seen as a much more intimate affair, much more like, just to give you the most obvious piece of data, half of all Jews who would die in the Holocaust were dead before the first gas chambers even came online. Right? And so a lot of shooting pits, people knew their people who were going to kill them. They knew them by social function. That was the school teacher, that was the principal, that was the lawyer, that was the priest, that was the scum, whoever. These often took place, these pogroms we're talking about in this 1-month period in cities the size of an American high school, right? 2,000 people, that kind of thing. There were different ethnic mixes in the regions. Our question is why? Basic question. Why those 10% of communities and not others, right? Why were some communities toxic and others relatively benign? That's the basic social science question we're asking. This is kind of really common, and I don't know about economics, but in political science, it's a whole industry now of the study of micro conflict. Okay. So what we do is we use the basic tool chest of political science. We look at all kinds. What were these places like before they had pogroms? And that's another thing that the Holocaust has really changed, our study of the Holocaust has really changed. It used to be the locus classicus of the Holocaust was the concentration camp. And indeed, that's a really important phenomenon, right? It's huge. But we now know that the Holocaust not only took place in camps, but those camps or these pogroms were in places, real places. And each one of these places have their own backstory. And it only stands to reason that the backstory of those places would have an impact on how it unfolded, right? So that's the bottom line. Okay, so I'm going to go through some stuff here. In this way, there's a need to integrate the Holocaust into the broader study of conflict, which is very controversial in Jewish studies, and I come out of Jewish studies, not just political science, in that people always say the Holocaust is unique. Well, of course it's unique in some broad sense, but broken up into little tiny events that in their aggregate we call the Holocaust, each one of those things are comparable with other things. So, for example, lynching in the American South, or Hindu-Muslim violence in India. You can compare this with that, and indeed the theories can inform it. So one of the most common theories in the United States is the power threat theory. That is, people are most likely to commit violence where they feel most threatened by the local minority, right? So a third of all counties in the United States never had a lynching in the period of lynching, right? And there's people who study that. So we're basically using the same tool chest to study this.
A third of counties in the South?
In the South. Yeah, never had it in the era between the end of Reconstruction and 1920, let's say. So the bottom line is our political science statement is where Jews were perceived as a political threat to the ownership of the state, locals used the opportunity to cleanse the town or village of Jews. That's our kind of main statement in the book, which contrasts with other things. So how do we know that pogroms happened? We have narratives. Lots of narratives. I grew up speaking Russian and I learned Polish for this project. So there's 7,200 testimonies at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. And I read a lot of them. They're mostly in Polish. They're excellent. They were done right after the war from 45 to 48. So nobody was kind of coached in what to say, right? Nobody had seen Schindler's List. So people didn't know what to say. Now you're kind of constrained what to say because we all know what happened. Nobody even used the word Holocaust. People use the word pogrom, but nobody used the word Holocaust. There's also memorial books. Every Jewish community who survived the war, they constructed these memorial books. You can see them online, many of them, at www.jewishgen.org. And they have a little thing called a shtetl finder. And if you have a friend or a grandparent who lived from a certain community, you put in that community and poof, a lot of stuff comes up, right? I mean, when the most record-obsessed people in the world decided they were going to kill the most literate people in the world, there was going to be a lot of writing about this, right? So, okay. It's coded as binary. Pogrom, no pogrom. This is slightly problematic in that there were worse pogroms and less worse pogroms. Some places where 1,000 people got killed, some places where just a couple of people got killed. The pictures I showed you because they're a pretty good description of what a pogrom actually is. It gives you the idea, right? It's a bit of a broad concept, but what we mean to distinguish it from is outsiders from outside the village coming in and just killing everybody, right? And even when that happened, there had to be a lot of local cooperation. People didn't know who Jews were. Jews looked like non-Jews, right? They weren't stamped on their forehead Jew, right? They depended on locals to do this, to kind of the joint production of violence. Okay. It's clear that there are necessary but insufficient conditions. No war, no pogroms, clearly. But that can't be a sufficient condition, otherwise we would have had way more pogroms. The Germans were everywhere. It can't be simply the previous Soviet presence for the same reason. The Soviets had occupied the entire region. Yet there were only 10% of places had pogroms. Now, it's important to realize that no pogroms happened where the Soviets did not occupy from 39 to 41. There were none. There were none in the old Soviet Union. There were none in German-occupied, where the old Soviet Union, where the Germans eventually invade after June 20, the pre-39 Soviet Union, where the Germans go into. There had been no pogroms in German-occupied central Poland. This was all in the Soviet zone. So there was something about Soviet occupation, but it's not only that, or else it would have happened everywhere. Of course, there was an order. This is the number 4 Nazi, right? Number 2 in the SS, Gerhard Heydrich, who says nothing is to be put in the way of self-cleansing actions of anti-communist and anti-Jewish sentiments in the occupied areas. Historians regularly regard that as the pogrom order, right? Although many pogroms happened before that, right? That's 7 days after the beginning of the war on the Eastern Front. The Soviet occupation zone, again, this is mostly, believe it or not, when I give this talk in synagogues, I have to show this because people don't even know where, Jews don't even know where this is, right? We're talking in this band here. Right? That's where the pogroms occur. What I wanted to be true, right, and actually doesn't work out all that well, is I thought, okay, those places where you had more anti-Semitism. Right? I have data on this, and I'm going to show you the data in a minute. So that's the most obvious. When you ask Holocaust survivors, why did they kill you? They say, because they hated us. Right? That's the most obvious, intuitive answer. Just to preface it, the reason this doesn't work as an explanation is it's too ubiquitous. There's always anti-Semitism. There's always people who hate Jews. There's always networks. Right? So I got to work on other explanations. Here are 2 anti-Semites, just in case you didn't have ever seen one before. Stepan Bandera, right, the head of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which armed, fed, watered by the Nazis, founded in 1929, but the Nazis take advantage of it. They invade with the Nazis in wearing Wehrmacht uniforms and carry out some bad stuff. That is Roman Dmowski, Polish nationalist. The current government in Poland likes him a great deal. He wasn't a Nazi, but he was definitely an anti-Semite. He was a kind of a sober person who thought that the Jews just represented political competition and economic competition for the Poles, and they weren't basically compatible with an independent Poland. A third of Poland in the interwar period was not Polish. Right? There were Jews, Ukrainians, Germans, and Belarusians. So it was a heavily minority state. Those of you who might be interested to know, Poland today is about 98% Polish. So the Germans and the Soviets solved that problem. So power threat theory, I wanted to give you the kind of basic theoretical framework. It says, I mean, it's a pretty ramified, articulated theory at this point, but that's used in the literature heavily. It says where minority groups threaten dominance of the majority will take action. It's stated very broadly like that. So it's usually used demographically. More Jews, more threat. Right? That's the basic proposition. In the United States, that's the way it's used all the time. More blacks, more threat, right, in the American South. We add on to that. We say, in fact, the threat is intensified where you have greater mobilization and support for Jewish nationalist parties. Now, these were Zionist, mostly Zionist parties. There were also Bundists, which were Yiddish Jewish nationalists. You can ignore that for the time being. These were mostly Zionists. And what did Zionism mean? I'll talk a little bit more about that. What it did not mean is you were going to the Middle East. There was no way of getting there. The British had basically cut it off. Some people got there, but very few, thousands, not 3 million. That's the number of Jews in Poland. It was a kind of a militant statement of an unwillingness to join the Polish nation-building project at that time. You could live in Poland, you could even be a member of parliament, and there were lots of Zionist members of Polish parliament, but you weren't going to join the Polish nation-building project. Another further threat would be the presence of non-Jewish parties that were tolerant of Jews. Local nationalists would view that as a threat too. We know that from the American South, right? The progressives and the Republicans were threats to the Democrats, right? So that's correlated in the American South with lynchings, right? It's pretty clear on that. Where all three were high, the threat would be the highest. Okay, the independent variables. So we have some data. For basically every village and city in all of Poland, we have the census data from 1921 and 1931. This was a huge pain in the ass to do. All this data collection was a giant pain in the ass, right? So we entered that, and we entered that. So that's basically ethnic, economic, religious, some other demographic characteristics. We have elections matched up to those same villages where pogroms did and didn't occur. There were two good, free, and fair elections in Poland, 1922 and 1928. We have basic control variables. We have socioeconomic competition. We know whether a place was a small market community, a Städel. We know we know levels of literacy. Did I spell literacy right? Okay, yeah. So that would be a problem. We have measures of anti-Semitism by vote for anti-Semitic parties. And I'm going to show you a little bit of the data, right? That's basically what I can do here. We have the vote for the communists. These were highly proportional representation elections. If you want to know where Israel got its idea for its parliament, its stupid voting rules, that is like the most proportional system in the world outside of the Netherlands, I think. That's why they had 22 parties in the Polish parliament. You had like 8 Jewish parties, right? Which is that famous joke about Jews, right? If a Jew was caught on a desert island, he would build 2 synagogues. One he would join, the other he would never step foot in, right? So they fight with each other, right? You know. So you have all these parties. You have the misnamed National Democratic Party of Poland, which is the Polish Anti-Semitic Nationalist Party, the NDEX, ND, National Democratic, right? Who that guy Dmowski was the head of. You have the party that's a tolerant. There was a coup in Poland in 1926 carried out by a guy named Marshal Pilsudski. He ran again in 1928, and he created this lovely name of a party, the BBWR, which is the Polish acronym for, get this, the Non-Party Bloc for Cooperation with the Government. So that's the Putin party, right? He's the Polish Putin. He's a dictator, he's authoritarian, but he's not a racist. And many times in history, and I'm sure there are people who study that the most democratic parties are not always the most tolerant, ethnically tolerant parties. They're sometimes highly majoritarian. Yes, Poland is for the Poles, and let's screw everybody else, right? Okay. Then there were the Zionists, who had formed this group, but in this part of Poland it was called the Minorities Bloc. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Zionists in a minute. And you have the communists. So I'm going to show you some data from these two areas, northeastern Poland. Poles and Jews in this area, Poles, Jews, and Belarusians in that area. Right? And so I have data on this. If you're interested in Ukrainians, I have all of that too. Right? But for now, I'm just going to show you this. It's the cleanest and easiest to show. Yeah, please.
So many of the communists, I imagine, were Jews as well, and in the Middle East, the Communist Party.
Yeah, I understand. Yes, we have articles on that too. So because you can take the data here and do ecological inference and find out basically pretty good estimates of which fraction of which ethnic group voted for which party. The answer is no. The answer is the leadership was heavily Jewish, but the voting base was not. Right? Jews as a voting base, the leadership was disproportionately Jewish, no doubt about it. So it's a good question, though. Okay, so what I'm going to show you next are some medians. 3 panels here. This is like no statistical assumptions whatsoever. We move to regression next, but I think this is actually the best. I mean, Jason and I argued about this to death. I think this is the best table in the book. So because it doesn't, I mean, you can move to regression way too quickly, and you don't learn anything then. So what I want to show you is the following. There's a couple of interesting results here. One is that, look at the difference between, that is the threat hypothesis, right? Pogroms are more likely to happen where the percentage and overall number of Jews is higher. Right? Now you might say, okay, that's not that interesting of a finding because any self-respecting pogromist is going to carry out the pogroms where the Jews are, not where they aren't. Right? But there's a whole line of literature out there that says that you're not unlikely to carry out violence where you're likely to face resistance. And you'd be more likely to face resistance where there are more of the group that you're going to do something bad to. Okay, so that's number one. The number 2 thing, this is this panel here, the second panel, is the percentage of vote for different groups. And all we've done here is we've taken that, you're economists, so I'm not going to go through these that carefully, but pogrom versus non-pogrom, simply broken them up, ones and zeros, right? The second is, you can ignore those first two groups. That's the Bund, which is in this part of Poland, which was an Jewish Industrial Socialist Workers' Party. My grandfather was a member of that. It wasn't industrialized, so nobody voted for the Bund in this area. Right? Orthodox Jews, there were Orthodox. These are the ones who walk around with the black hats, who are really easily identifiable. We can ignore that for the time being, too. Let's look at the last three. Right? Does this thing work at all? You know what? I don't need it. This is the Zionists. This is the first thing I wanted to point you to the difference of. The vote for the Zionists where there were pogroms was 22 times higher than when there were no pogroms. The vote for the Polish nationalists is the next one down. There is a difference, 13% versus 9%. In the multivariate, you'll see it washes away. It's not that it's not important, it is important. Remember, these are highly proportional elections. So to get 10% of the vote, in Israel, you can form a government with 10% of the vote. I don't know, what did Bibi get in the last election? I can't remember. It was maybe 27%, right? So in highly proportional elections, 10% is good. Then there was a really interesting result, the communists. It turns out that where communism was strong, there were no pogroms. Communism is an immunizer against pogroms. And why? There's an explanation for that. It has to do with kind of non-liberal universalism of communism. This is the one party, we know that from the United States, in fact, right, from the early history of the Communist Party here. It was one of the parties where people could actually get together from different ethnic groups. They may have been violent. Communists, Stalinists were violent, but they weren't racist. They used violence for other things, right? What we do here, this is sort of interesting because you could say that, well, of course the Zionists got more votes because there were so many more Jews there. These results aren't that surprising. So what we did here in this last thing is re-estimate with one assumption. The assumption here was that only Jews could have voted for the Zionist Party. So we excluded the Poles from even possibly voting for the Zionist Party. We created a separate electorate, if you will. And we also said only Poles would have voted for Polish nationalists. That is, there was no, actually, you're the only one who's old enough to appreciate this. There was no Jews for Buchanan phenomenon, right? What happened in Florida, if you remember, right? So it shows that even making that assumption, the medians are still, the differences are still really big. Okay. So that's the first cut. Here's the regression, okay? And this, sorry? Is it badly misaligned? No, it's actually not misaligned. It's not misaligned at all. All right, okay, yeah, but I can see how you would think it was because it's way up. So what this shows, when I present this one in public, I say this shows I'm right. As you can see, right, so what we have here are we do two sets of estimates, right? We do a logit estimate and we do a non-parametric, right? And for the obvious reasons that the logit imposes a certain structure on the data and we weren't always sure what the structure should be, so we just did both for robustness purposes. And what you can see is under both methods, the Zionists, right, the vote for the Zionists is very powerful, even controlling for these other things. The Polish nationalists, it's there, not quite as powerful. And the communists, it goes away. The Jews just slightly above it, but although, with the confidence intervals, it's not always certain. When we found this, we were totally blown away, actually, right? We sat on this result for years because it's not what we wanted to find and we had trouble interpreting it. But, eventually we do have a good story that goes along with this. Okay. Yeah, okay, there's the description of it. Do you want to spend time on? I mean, because you're economists, I don't know what you like to spend time on.
I had a couple of questions, but I was going to ask, is one interpretation that these places are just, the reason why people are voting for the Zionist bloc is because there's more residual anti-Semitism in those regions?
Great question. So what I did is I had this idea that maybe they'd had pogroms before. in those areas. So at the YIVO, the last round of pogroms in this area of the world was 1918 to 1920 after World War I. A lot of people died. They were mostly warlordism. It was slightly different from this. It was mostly outsiders coming into the village and killing people, Ukrainians, Poles, Russians. There's a guy who studied those right afterwards, and there's a great dissertation for an economist. Awesome. You could go in there. There are spreadsheets that were done on foolscap, right, with a guy right after 1921, and he has place, how many people died, how many people were raped, how many people were injured. You could reconstruct this data set. When I found that, I said, this is amazing. I'm going to tell that story. They don't match. They don't match. So I'd say the story is more parties looking where there were a lot of people who they could recruit. So the high Jewish population led Zionist parties to spend their scarce resources on areas where there were Jews. That's not that surprising, right? You wouldn't send a Zionist party into a village that had 3 Jews. You'd be wasting your time. And it's not surprising that those places Jews were more likely to politically assimilate. Yeah?
So non-parametric regressions, they still impose monotonicity.
Yeah, I mean, no, they basically, my understanding is, is basically let the data speak. They almost let the data speak for themselves.
So how would we, if there were a curvilinear relationship, what would it look like?
I think it would give you a projection.
Yes. So let me show you right now.
Yeah, if it were non-monotonic, then it would just.
Oh, actually, that's not, shit, that's not what I, okay. Oh, no. Hold on.
You have to explicitly check.
So you'd be getting some sort of.
No.
An average.
Okay, I just screwed up my whole presentation. You know what, I brought the wrong slide, but that's okay. It's not the end of the world. So what happens is the following. The non-parametric takes you up to a probability, because I brought the wrong slide. That's all right, I can explain it. Because this slide is not exactly accurate. Can't believe I did this.
My question is motivated by the intuition that if Jews had been 70% of the population or 80% of the population, eventually they would have had enough of the power.
Yes.
So,
Alas, the action is in the middle. Right? The action is in the middle. Yes, if everybody's Jewish, you're not going to get a pogrom. Absolutely. And if everybody loves Jews, you're not going to get a pogrom.
but you don't see any.
Well, no. The action is definitely in the middle there. You see, let's see if I can go back to that slide. Shit. It's the wrong slide. So what you see is the non-parametric one goes above 1. It shows the probability as above 1 because it places and so what'll happen is with the logit, it'll asymptotically approach. It won't let you go above 1, right? It's fine. I mean, this is the relationship. It's just a relationship for the wrong part of Poland. I put it in the wrong slide, but it's the same story. It's the same story. It shows you that, right? The predicted probability of pogrom goes up with the support for the Zionists, right? But it's a very important observation. We address that methodologically in the book, right? That, there is definitely some curvilinearity. We try to get at it anymore. That's why the descriptive results are so important, right? Because the regression could lead you astray here terribly.
But the descriptive result, you can't tell whether there's
No, you can't, but what you can tell is if there's some kind of, you can't get it inside of it testing against the other ones, but you can actually say, okay, by and large, is there an effect worth actually exploring? Yeah. Okay. Let me take a minute and talk about the Zionists. How am I doing? I'm doing okay on time, actually. Okay.
10 minutes.
10 minutes, easy. Yeah. Okay. That is the head of the Polish Zionists, Yitzhak Grunbaum, right? What's the story I'm trying to tell? What's my interpretation of the data? He was the head Zionist. He spoke perfect Polish. He wanted to be a cabinet minister in interwar Poland. There was not one Jewish, not one Belarusian, not one German, not one Ukrainian cabinet member in interwar Poland. I mean, there's been more Arab cabinet members in Israel, well, actually 2, than there has been, than there ever was minorities in cabinet ministers in Poland. They just were iced out of governments. He was despised. He was actually, and what happens to him, interestingly, it's kind of a side story, he leaves Poland in 19 1935. He's one of the ones who does make it to Palestine. He becomes Israel's first minister of the interior, right, in 1948. His son stays in Poland, gets arrested by the Nazis, put in a concentration camp, becomes a capo, a collaborator, survives the war, goes to Paris, goes to Israel, and dies in the 1948 war. These stories are totally, that's another guy worth writing a dissertation on. What it meant to vote for the Zionists was you were not going to join the nation-building project. It was a militant Jewish nationalism. It did not mean you couldn't be part of Poland. What it meant, though, is you were not going to be ethnically Polish. You were not going to be culturally Polish. Who were the Jews voting for if they didn't vote for their Zionist parties? A lot of them voted for this guy, Józef Pilsudski, the dictator, who never was a full dictator. As I said, the Jews liked him. When he died in 1935, they sent the rabbis all went to his funeral. His mistress was Jewish. I don't know if that really matters, but you know, he was many bad things, but not an anti-Semite. So we want to know, was there an effect of those Jews supporting him, right? So that's an ecological regression of using Gary King's, well, actually it's Rosen and Tanner and blah, 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 blah. They have this nice, very nice solution to the ecological inference problem where you can do multiple cells, estimate simultaneously multiple cells. What I want to point you to, so this is pogroms, no pogroms in this area of Poland, and Jewish support for this Pilsudski party. Notice it's twice as high where there are no pogroms. And that's kind of the effect we're looking for. Now, you know, it's a pretty thin reed to hang the whole thing on. There was Jewish support for other parties too, for social democrats. Not much support for the communists. We estimate the Jewish support for the communists in other articles. It's not very high, right? But it's mostly this. This is kind of an important little finding. Okay. Oops. If you're interested in in literacy, in the socioeconomic stuff, under some, you know, this is, where is the literacy? Here. Under some estimates, it does come up as significant. Modernization variables, I don't know about economics, but in political science, they're almost always significant. And what that tells you is in those places where the Jews lived among people who were more illiterate, there was more likely to be a pogrom. There's a socioeconomic effect. Okay. I have data on Ukrainian areas. Let me skip that, though. I'm going to go to the conclusions. So there are really three. One is, under the right circumstances, pre-existing polarization is deadly. Number two, and there's a political assimilation effect, not economic, not cultural assimilation. Jews didn't need to culturally assimilate in order to be protected. And certainly I'm not trying to blame the Jews here for the pogroms, right? I mean, this is clearly the Zionists didn't know that their organization would ultimately lead to a kind of a diminishment of local solidarity, which is really the effect we're talking about, which could, under the right circumstances, be deadly. Pogroms are situational rather than endemic, and I think it's helpful that we kind of recontextualize nationalism, the Soviet occupation, even the war itself, all of which have a proper place, but in themselves don't tell us where these things would happen. And that also interesting, and this is actually in contrast to maybe some economics, maybe some assumptions within economics. Within political science and sociology, who helped and who didn't help Jews is often studied as a methodologically individual level. That is to say, who are the good people, who are the bad people? The good priest, the bad priest. The good lawyer, the bad lawyer. What this shows, it was way easier to be a good priest in certain kinds of villages. And the data, the narratives that I use bear that out. The Jews run to the priest and they say, stop the pogrom. The priest says, I'd like to, but I can't. We will also be overrun. I will be overrun by my flock. They will throw me into the mud. So this takes the emphasis in our study of these things away from the character traits. Were they rich? Were they poor? Were the people who helped or didn't help? Were they rich? They were poor. Religious? Not religious? All the kind of battery of sociological categories that have been thrown at these people in order to understand their behavior. This actually shows that it may take a village, right? So that's my presentation. Thanks.
I was wondering if you could speak to how this, because you mentioned the hypothesis, which I found in Timothy Schneider's book, Bloodlands, but it's where...
He's the reviewer for the book, yeah.
So his story, for the rest of you, is the intersection, it's where the Soviets were after 39, as you say, between 39 and 41, when you get the worst violence against Jews. But I understood the story to be particularly because the interaction between the perception of Jewish support for the communists were perceived as being Jewish, the NKVD were perceived as being Jewish, and so it was once the NKVD fled, there was like revenge against communists, which was taken out on the local Jews, and so I was wondering if you had any data in the book which speaks to that. In particular, like, do you know where the NKVD were based, or where that kind of Soviet activity was most intense?
So it's a good question. On the one hand, it's true, right? There's no doubt that when the Soviets leave, the Germans roll into some places, Lvov, right, with a naked woman being chased. They come into some places and they find the NKVD prison, with the KGB, the NKVD prison, and it's stuffed full of the corpses of Ukrainian or Polish nationalists. The Nazis, the SS, etc., invites locals and said, "You see what the Jews did to your people?" Right? And then the pogrom starts, and those can be especially vicious pogroms. The problem is the map of KGB prisons and the map of the pogroms it's not really good. I mean, it doesn't work very well. Where our story speaks to that issue is on the question of, indeed, they may have thought the Jews were collaborating with the Soviets. It just so happens that if that was the cause of the pogroms, that was distributed, and if that suspicion, that desire for revenge, was distributed in a weird way. And that distribution itself has to be explained. And our data does better to explain that than the actual. There's no evidence that the Soviet occupation was any worse where there was pogroms than where there weren't. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. So, I mean, it doesn't say that's wrong. But what it says is that that explanation doesn't fully convince either. Yeah?
Yeah, I was wondering, you mentioned that there were other minorities
Yes.
in the area.
Yes.
So what was happening with them, both in terms of pogroms, and did they have a nationalist project equivalent to
Yes.
Zionism?
So the Poles clearly did, right? That was the Polish nation-building project had been going on since 1795, since the second partition of Poland, when Poland ceased to exist, and they'd been really trying. Ukrainians as well. The Ukrainians were really also a stateless people who had been granted a kind of an ersatz nationalism under the Soviets in this Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and then the area, the heartland of Ukrainian nationalism, however, was in Poland, in western. Let me show you the map. Oops. In Volhynia, Lvov, Tarnopol, and Stanislavov. That is called Eastern Galicia, right? It's the core of Ukrainian nationalism, even today. They'd been trying for a long time. That's the Piedmont of Ukrainian nationalism. They'd been trying for a while to form their own country. They didn't really want to be part of Poland. The other group is the Belarusians. They are the least nationalist of any of the groups. They had the least national consciousness. In fact, in the Polish census of 1931, when asked, "What are you?" like what ethnic group are you? They would say, "Tutieshi." We're from here. We're here's, right? Now they would know they were Christian, right? But they wouldn't know, okay, how does that fit into the broader nation building? So there is evidence, a part of our evidence is also from the SS reports, the Einsatzgruppenberichte, and they complained they couldn't get Belarusians to commit pogroms. They complain all the time, right? The Nazis wanted the locals to do this. There's no doubt about it, right? But they only succeeded in some places and others. So indeed, nationalism may be an important factor. It's just not determinate at the local level. You want to cut me off? Not a problem. Not a problem at all.
Thank you very much, Jeff.
Thank you.